Good day, everybody. My name is Jared. I'm one of the senior consultants here at Cirrus Consulting Group. And the purpose of today's webinar is myself, as well as Jonathan Moffett from Aligned Advisors, are going to talk to you about how to best position yourselves for your transition out of dentistry. And so, the company that I represent, Cirrus Consulting Group, are a tenant representation firm that really work exclusively with medical professionals, 95% of which are dentists. As you guys are aware, dentistry is unique in the sense that when you look to eventually sell your practice, the sale of your practice is completely contingent or dependent on the landlord approving or denying consent to transfer the lease agreement. So in order to actually derive max value, you have to have your lease properly set up. So I'm going to spend some time talking specifically about how to set the lease agreement up for transition. Afterwards, Jonathan Moffett will be speaking from Aligned Advisors. And Jonathan founded Aligned Advisors several years ago with the sole purpose of protecting dentists from outside threats so that they can live the life they really want to live both during and after their dental careers. Now, with respects to the lease agreement itself, the unfortunate reality is that over 83% of dentists across the country have an office lease that can prevent them from ever selling their practice. 20% of dentists actually will lose the ability to sell their practice in a given calendar year. And as well, 75% of dentists today are signing lease agreements with redevelopment or demolition clauses in addition to other particular clauses which at some point in time can make them to either have to unexpectedly relocate or move their practice. Now, to give you some quick little background about Cirrus Consulting Group, as I mentioned, we've been in business for about 20 years. We work exclusively with medical professionals, 95% of which are dentists. And so over the course of a calendar year, we will analyze approximately 1,500 lease agreements, of which we will negotiate about 700 to 1,000 of those. And so who are the types of doctors that we speak with? We speak to a lot of startup doctors in the early part of their career, a lot of doctors in the middle portion of their career looking to renew the lease, but a key, call it bucket of doctors that we speak with are doctors in that last third of their career really thinking about transition. What's that process going to look like? How am I going to set the practice up for sale and to derive maximum practice value? And so we will give about 150 speaking engagements across the country every year. We are CE accredited and speak across the country at the GNY, Yankee, Hinman, among many seminars that we put on ourselves, and well as in conjunction with our partners as well. And so as far as the bucket or the geography of doctors that we work with, we really will work with doctors in every corner of the country. From Alaska, our CEO was actually last week putting on a couple seminars in Hawaii, to California, Florida, New York, and every corner in between. And the reason this is important is by working across the country with every different type of geography, every different type of landlord, it really gives us some good background as to what are the best goals, what are the best strategies to implement moving forward to achieve maximum results. Because when we're dealing with an institutional landlord in Manhattan, we might deal differently than when we're dealing with a mom and pop landlord in Paducah, Kentucky. And the type of real estate, there's no one size fits all lease agreement. You may have heard of or seen the term standard form lease. There really is no such thing as a standard form lease, and so by working with this wide demographic, it's allowed us to really come up with and implement particular strategies based off of each particular need across the spectrum. And so really the importance of the webinar, and again, the focus is, while there are many important elements in the lease agreement, the focus for today's webinar is going to be, to teach you about the importance of the office lease agreement, particularly as it applies to transition. So we're going to talk a little bit about the assignment clause and how it affects your ability to actually transfer or sell the practice, talk to you about what type of guarantees, personal guarantees that you might have. The older you get, typically the higher your asset base grows, the lower your debt is, and it becomes more and more important to separate or shield your personal assets from business assets, and particularly to make sure that once you sell your practice that you're actually absolved of any liability. And lastly, how to structure your lease agreement to increase your flexibility, i.e. ability to sell, and minimize any potential landlord interference. And so having said that, we're going to spend a few minutes here, talking about what is a lease agreement. And so, if you spend a few seconds here about thinking what is a lease agreement, the first thing that typically comes to mind is it's a check. It's a significant financial commitment that you're making from yourself to the landlord. One thing with dentistry is one of the most expensive businesses to get in. Whether you look to purchase a practice or build one out from scratch, it is a very capital intensive or expensive investment that you're making. So why would we have a lease agreement? If you were to, let's say, open up a practice and the landlord, you spent $150,000, $250,000, and a landlord said to you, you know what, we don't need to have a lease agreement. Do you think that would be in your favor or not in your favor? And so the lease agreements really are some of the oldest business contracts, and they've been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And essentially, the point of a legal contract between a landlord and tenant is to have predictability, and predictability really comes in two separate ways. On the landlord side, it comes on getting a predictable, annuitized cash flow from you, the tenant. And on the tenant side, it comes with predictability in the space. And it really is critical for both parties, for both you and the landlord. And really the point of the lease agreement is to make sure that we clearly and specifically state what are your obligations and requirements as a tenant, and what are the landlord's obligations and requirements. And for example, if something goes wrong at any point, if a rental check is missed, if the center burns down, if the HVAC breaks, well, what is going to happen here? And while the page one, let's call it, of a lease agreement that will stipulate base rental rate increases, et cetera, is always extremely important, there are clauses within page 2 to page 70, 80, 90, however big your lease agreement is, that can have much larger financial implications on the practice. And so as far as what your lease should do for you, there's a few things that we're going to talk about generally about what the lease really needs to do for you. So the first thing is fair and affordable financial terms. So we talked about this with respects to fair and affordable financial terms. The economics is always very important. We license some proprietary software that gives us the ability to pull information on vacancy, rental rates anywhere in the country. For any of you listening right now, if you would like to connect at a later date, we would be able to pull some reports for you to advise you if you're over or underpaying in rent. The financials are always extremely important. So when you're looking at either starting up a new practice or renewing your lease agreement, it's always critical that you're setting fair terms. And fair terms have to be relative. So they have to be relative to the market, i.e., what am I paying relative to properties around me? So if someone tells me that their rent's too high and I pull reports and it seems to be fair market, it could be a production issue. And typically the ADA recommends you want to have your rent as a percentage of overall production no higher than about 8 to 10%. So that's something to consider too about whether that's coming internally or externally. Now, secondly, to look at long-term stability and security. So I mentioned a few minutes ago how dentistry is one of the most expensive businesses to get into. For that reason, we always recommend trying to negotiate as much long-term stability and security within the lease agreement as possible. And so what do I mean by that? So typically what we're referring to there is we're referring to the term of the lease agreement. So when you look to sign a term for 90% of doctors that I speak with, we recommend signing a 10-year term with 5-year options, probably 2 5-year options to renew. Reason being, when you do that, it maximizes your leverage and flexibility to negotiate. It also maximizes the amount of runway or term that you're leaving for a prospective transition. So as it relates to actually selling your practice, when you look to sell your practice, the first thing that a buyer is going to do is they're going to look to get financing. Most banks, and we deal with most major banks, Wells, Citizen, Fargo, most banks will require a minimum of 7 years of term remaining on the lease agreement in order to sell the practice. Meaning that if you right now have a lease agreement expiring in 2017 with 1 5-year option to renew, and you plan on selling your practice in 3 years, it would be nearly impossible for someone to actually obtain financing to acquire the practice, because whoever obtained financing, what the bank does is they spread out or amortize the loan over the amount of term remaining on the lease agreement. So at the very minimum, you want to leave about 7 to 10 years of term after when you plan on selling the practice, but the more runway you can leave yourself and a prospective buyer, the better position you're going to put yourself in. The second thing to talk about is minimizing risk and exposure. So when I talk about minimizing your risk and your exposure as it relates to this particular webinar, we're really going to focus on speaking about the personal guarantee. If any of you have your lease agreement in front of you now, and if you don't, take a look later, take a look on whether you signed the lease agreement under your corporation or did you sign it under your personal name. If you signed it under your personal name, did you provide a personal guarantee or indemnifier? The vast majority of doctors that we speak with have provided personal guarantees or indemnifiers on the lease agreement. What that essentially means is that if you were to ever get into any type of dispute with the landlord, that the landlord could come after not only the business assets, but all of your personal assets as well. Your car, your home, joint assets you might have with your spouse. Not ideal at all from a liability perspective. When I'm speaking to a doctor who's 33 years old, just graduated school, maybe has been associating for a couple of years, looking at opening up their first practice, and we're speaking with a landlord and the landlord's requesting a personal guarantee, at that point it is a somewhat reasonable thing for the landlord to be asking. The debt-to-asset ratio isn't there, the work experience isn't there, and so it's a lot more reasonable for the landlord to want the client to provide a personal guarantee. For doctors who've been in their space for 10, 15, 20 years, been practicing, no issues making rental payments, at that point it's a lot less reasonable for the client to be providing a personal guarantee. And so regardless of what stage of your career that you're in, a key element here is to always try to kind of minimize your risk or exposure and separate the personal assets from the business assets as much as possible. The other thing is maximizing flexibility, and this is a really key element as it pertains to what we're talking about. So when I ask the question, how many of you plan on selling your practice in the next 20 years? The follow-up question I have to that is, what makes you think that you have the right to actually sell your practice? So what I mentioned earlier is that when you look to sell your practice, the sale of the practice is completely contingent or dependent on the landlord approving or denying consent to transfer the lease agreement. And so this occurs through the assignment and subletting provision. What we always recommend, regardless of whether you're 35 or 65, is to set the lease agreement up in such a way that's going to facilitate or allow you to sell the practice at any point. Now, we're going to go through an actual example of an assignment provision where we're going to talk about that in a little bit further detail. So as far as the sale of your practice, we deal with practice acquisition brokers all over the country, and the sale of your practice really stems from three things. It's your equipment, your patient charts or goodwill, and the third thing is the lease agreement itself. The lease agreement is really the kind of glue that holds together and maximizes practice value. And while this graph isn't proportional, we've seen cases where the lease agreement can represent up to 100% of the sale of your practice. And I'll give you a short example. I was speaking with a doctor a couple months ago. He was looking to sell his practice to an associate doctor who had been there for about 8 months. The doctor had a relocation clause in his lease agreement that allowed the landlord to move him to any other space within the building with a 60-day notice. The original purchase price was a $1.3 million purchase price. Before the agreement went through, the landlord had provided the relocation notice to this client, who was then referred over to us by someone through Henry Schein, one of our corporate partners. And essentially, the relocation moved him from about 1,800 square feet to 1,500 square feet, and from exposure on the corner to 2 streets to the back of the plaza. And so when all was said and done and the relocation occurred and there was actually some downtime at the practice ended up selling for significantly less than the original price that was agreed upon between the associate and the selling doctor. And so that's what I mean by the lease agreement can represent a large portion of the overall sale of your practice. So rather than run into an issue with it, there's things that you can do, which we'll continue to discuss, that will actually facilitate maximizing the sale of the practice and practice value. Now, when it comes to actually achieving this, this is one of the most important key slides that we're going to discuss, and it's the tenant lease cycle. And so one thing all of you should be doing when this webinar is over and you find your lease agreement is take a look at when your lease is expiring. The ideal time to want to start a lease negotiation is about 2 to 3 years prior to advance. Some of you might be thinking that seems too far, but one thing landlord will do is they will, and some of you might have experienced this firsthand, they will delay the process as much as possible to get you as close to that expiration date. The closer you get to your expiration date, the less leverage that you have to negotiate the terms of the deal. In addition to this, most of you will have options to renew. We'll talk about this in a second. Your options to renew typically have to be exercised within a certain time frame, anywhere between 6 to 15 months prior to advance. So when you think about negotiating a deal, you should really be aiming for whenever that option renew deadline is. So, we have a lot of people at our firm that used to work for large brokerages like, Cushman Wakefield, Colliers, Jones Lang LaSalle, and the first thing that they teach you when you work for a large landlord representative is delay the process as much as possible. Particularly for you as a dentist, if you had to pick up and relocate your practice, We recommend a minimum of 12 months, ideally, to actually be able to go find a space, plumb it out, build it out, equip it, etc. Much more difficult for you to pick up and relocate your business than almost any other type of tenant. And so one of the key takeaways that should be focused on your end is starting the process as early as possible. Now, just going to focus on, as an exercise, a couple key provisions that we'll look at, and we've alluded to a few of them. And the first one is the option to renew. And so option to renew, as most of you are aware, once you're done your initial term, will be an option that you have to exercise moving forward, whether it's additional 5 years, 10 years. You know, the simplest thing I can say, and it might sound like common sense, but believe me, it's not. If you have options to renew, know what they are and when they have to be exercised. I was speaking to a client in Florida in his late 30s. He had spent almost $500,000 building out an office 4 years ago. He signed a 5-year lease agreement, missed his option to renew deadline. The landlord advised him that he is not renewing the lease agreement. He's found another dentist who's coming in willing to pay significantly more rent, and we're now in the process of actually relocating this client. And so make sure, if you do have options to renew, know when are the options start. Do not miss the expiry date, and particularly focus on the exercise dates. Now, if you guys can all just spend a minute here quickly reading through this clause, and then we're going to go through it together. And so if you read the first line says, provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain as the tenant. What is the issue with there? The issue is that the options to renew are personal to Dr. Joe Black. So let's say one of you have a 10-year lease and you're 8 years in, and you have 2 5-year options to renew that you think that there's plenty of time, if you need to sell your practice, that someone can get financing. If the options are personal to you, they're not worth anything to a prospective buyer. A lot of the times it won't say, provided the tenant Dr. so-and-so, it'll actually have a capital T. Whenever there is a term that is capitalized in a lease agreement, it means it is defined. If the term is defined as a capital letter T and it's defined as you personally, it would mean that the options are not transferable to a prospective buyer. Very key to make sure any options that you do negotiate can be transferred upon assignment. The second line, and then it says, and if the tenant duly has regularly paid its rent and performed its covenants under the obligation of the lease and has not been in default. Again, the word default there is capitalized, and so typically most people think of default as missed rental payments, and they think there might be some other deadbeat dentists out there who miss the rent, but I'm not one of them. I can tell you there's many ways to default on your lease agreement aside from missing rent. There's a client that I dealt with last year in California whose office was closed on Fridays. There was a section within the lease agreement entitled Hours and Operations that required the office to be open Monday to Friday, 8 to 5. When we started going through the renewal process, the landlord advised we're not renewing the lease agreement. And we said, what do you mean you're not renewing the lease agreement? They said, as per the hours of operation section, the client has been in habitual default. The building has been closed Fridays, almost every Friday. Here are pictures with times of the unit being closed Friday. Therefore, we're not renewing the lease agreement. So there's many ways to default on a lease agreement aside from missing rent. Then the other thing, it says any such renewal should be on the landlord's then current standard form lease. Again, when I said before, there's no such thing as a standard form lease agreement. Really, if the landlord's going to be presenting a new standard form lease agreement to a prospective buyer, there's no value that you're getting there. And so what I said prior about using the lease agreement to really maximize value, that's a key part as far as being able to transfer the lease agreement. And then it goes on to say that in no event shall the rent be less than what was paid in the last year of the original term. And so a lot of the times what can kill a deal if the options aren't transferred properly is if a buyer needs to enter into an agreement negotiating rental rates with the landlord, because a particular purchase price is going to be predicated on a particular rental rate. So it's always advisable to actually set the rental rate and set what all the proper increases are so that rent cannot be negotiated when you look to actually sell or transfer the practice. And then lastly, it says that the rent shall then be determined on arbitration by the market rent for the renewing tenants in the building. For any of you in, for example, a retail plaza, if there's a Starbucks in the plaza or any major retailer, they will pay what's called percentage rent. So they'll pay their rent as a percentage of what they actually produce. Typically, they pay much higher amounts, so it's not really fair to pay based on market rent. There's much more that needs to go into that, and it's much more beneficial to you to be able to lay that out specifically in the lease agreement versus having to go through a third-party arbitrator. Now, as far as the potential cost of this mistake, having to potentially relocate unexpectedly, having to absorb significant rent increases, or not having enough term remaining on the lease agreement to actually sell your practice, as you can see, very potentially costly financial decisions with respect to not properly structuring the option periods. Again, quickly, we're going to go through an assignment provision. If you can just spend a minute or so reading this, and we'll walk through it together. And so in the interest of time, we'll go through this a little bit quicker, but one thing to just talk generally about the assignment provision, when you look to sell your practice, the sale of the practice is completely contingent or dependent on the landlord approving or denying consent to transfer the lease. One thing that we're seeing that's much more common is landlords are making the argument that a percentage of the value of your practice is derived from the fact that you practice out of their particular location. So they will leverage their ability to approve or deny consent to transfer, oftentimes to ask for some sort of remuneration in a percentage of the sale proceeds. That's why it's critical that you're actually laying out a very, very clear process as far as what is required for the landlord to approve or deny consent. Another thing is, in 90% of lease agreements, you're actually still liable for the terms and provisions of the lease. And so if you've provided a personal guarantee and you're still liable for the lease agreement, it means that the landlord could come after your personal assets years after you sell the practice. Now, in relation to the exercise, it says that, as I mentioned, that any assignment shall first have received consent from the landlord. What does that mean, though? It's very arbitrary as to what is required for the landlord to approve or deny consent. When we get involved, we get very granular and specific about what should be required for the landlord to approve or deny the consent. The next thing that's being referenced is a termination right. So it says that upon request, the landlord shall actually have the right to terminate the lease agreement or increase the rent essentially by 15%. A lot of institutional landlords will have what's referred to as a termination right. The reason they will have this is essentially to maximize their leverage during the negotiations. If you do have a termination right, there's particular ways that they need to be dealt with, but something that's very concerning that needs to be dealt with prior, ideally years prior than you looking to sell. And then lastly, what we talked about, it says that the tenant shall not be released from its obligations under the lease, but should remain fully liable. So this is what we talked about as far as continued liability. But whether you're in a middle part of your career or looking at selling immediately, it's critical to properly set the practice up for sale as soon as possible. Again, the cost of these mistakes can be extremely, have an extreme high financial impact on the practice. Other traps in the lease agreement that, in the interest of time, we're not going to spend a ton of time talking about right now, but things like, do the landlord have a demolition or relocation clause? The relocation clause would allow them to move you to another space in the building, and the demo clause would allow them to essentially tear down the building. Things like, do you have any exclusivity provisions not allowing any other dentist to move into the building? One thing we look to add into every lease agreement is what's called a death and disability provision. I know it sounds morbid, but essentially what a death and disability provision does is it protects you, God forbid something were to happen to you. So if you signed a long-term lease agreement and God forbid something were to happen, essentially the landlord, you would still be obligated, you or your family would still be obligated to pay the remainder of the term left on the lease agreement. So what the provision does is it allows you to either sell the practice in conjunction with the assignment provision or terminate the lease agreement. But there are many other clauses that need to be addressed that in the interest of time for this webinar we're not going to, but absolutely happy to address those with each individual at a later date. And as far as the right treatment plan, just to speak about briefly, so it starts with gathering the documentation. So many doctors I speak to out there, they've got their lease agreement, they put it in a back drawer, it's been hiding there for 8 years, 10 years, they haven't looked at it. Do your best to actually gather all the documentation, any amendments, riders, addendums, so you have the ability to put a proper plan in place. Then we would look to actually review and identify all of the hidden issues with the lease agreement. So any issues with the legal language, assignment provisions, personal guarantees, etc. At that point, we spend some time with our market research team taking a look at the economics. So taking a look at what you're paying on your rental rates relative to market value so we can see, as far as addressing the economics, where you stand currently. Then typically we will hop on a call. It's a 1-hour consultative phone call, and after viewing the webinar, I'll have my information there. We do have our partner Shine, among other partners, subsidize some vouchers where essentially we get on an hour phone call and we talk to you about the history of the practice, kind of what your goals and objectives are moving forward to make sure that the proper outcome and strategy is being put in place. And while we do that, everything that's been done up to that point, what haven't we done is we haven't actually picked up the phone and called the landlord. And so many people I speak to, they want to renew their lease agreement, make some changes. The first thing they do is they pick up the phone and call the landlord. But they haven't put a plan in place. They don't know what their lease looks like. They don't know what the economics look like. So a key element is to actually put the plan in place prior to engaging the landlord. At that point, during the lease negotiation financials, we will negotiate all of the economics to do with the lease agreement. So base rent increases, any cosmetic touch-ups, TIs, etc. And then next we'll go through all of the legal documents, making sure your liability is limited, the practice is being set up for sale, no personal guarantees, etc. When we're finally done this process, which usually on average takes about 30 or 40 hours per file, and we get all the documentation back, we will actually spend a significant amount of time reviewing and re-reviewing the lease agreement. You wouldn't believe how many times we get paperwork back from the landlord, and what we discussed for the last 30 hours is not clearly shown in the lease agreement, or there's some sort of discrepancies. Again, to reiterate for any of you thinking about their renewal, is the timing is critical. So you want to start the process as early as possible. Ideally 24 as far as 36 months prior to advance. For any of you that are approaching, call it the danger zone of 12 to 8 or less months, we deal with dozens and dozens and dozens of clients within that time frame. And so obviously time is a little bit more of the essence there, but the earlier that you can start the process, the better position you're going to put yourself in. So just to kind of review very briefly the key components of going into buying and selling practices. Lots of term to be able to transfer the practice. Typically those are through your options to renew. Making sure that the personal guarantee is removed or is limited, that you don't have any liability post-sale. Critical in making sure the assignment provision is properly structured to facilitate a smooth transfer of the practice. Make sure you're absolved of all liability. Make sure that the landlord is not entitled to any of a percentage of the sale proceeds of your practice. And lastly, limiting liability further within stuff like a death and disability clause. And there are many other clauses that we look to negotiate that in the interest of time we're not going to touch upon now, but these are really the key elements. And so as I mentioned last time, as I mentioned last time, for anyone who is interested in receiving a consultation, my information will be up afterwards. You can reach out. But I do want to pass the presentation off to Jonathan from Aligned Advisors, and Jonathan is going to speak to you a little bit about kind of the history of Aligned, what their purpose is in really helping dentists better enjoy life both during and after their dental careers. And so having said that, I will pass it off to Jonathan from here.
Thanks, Jared. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Okay, great, thanks. So, yeah, thanks, Jared. And, Jared, if you were a Baptist preacher and you said, can I get a witness, I'd stand up and definitely raise my hand, because you guys have worked, as you know, with several of our clients and helped them get out of some pretty hairy situations with their leases. And so definitely you guys do some good work, and we've certainly been a witness to that. So, my name is Jonathan Moffett. My company is Aligned Advisors, and typically one of the frequent questions we get asked is, why did we decide to work with dentists? And I always answer that question with the truth, which is my grandfather, Dr. Gordon Moffett, who was a very successful orthodontist in Southern California, had several practices, made, from what I have been told by my uncles and my father, he made high six figures and low seven figures throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s throughout his career, and should have, by all means, been able to, when he stopped practicing, live a very successful life with he and my grandmother. In 1997, my grandfather, who's pictured here on the right with a bow tie, he wore a bow tie every day, even to work in his practice. In 1997, on Thanksgiving Day, he actually suffered a heart attack during Thanksgiving dinner. It wasn't a major heart attack. In fact, many of us didn't even know that it had happened. But what we later learned was it would actually end his career as an orthodontist. Throughout that next year, as my grandfather was in and out of hospitals and in and out of healthcare facilities, he thought he would always go back to practicing again, but in actuality what happened was, because he waited so long, his practices actually dwindled down to very little. And by the time my father and my father's brother, who was an attorney, was able to actually sell off what was left, there was very little left. When you talk to my uncles and you talk to people that knew my grandparents, they lived a very fun life. They would take these fantastic vacations to Europe and Hawaii regularly, but when it came to planning for his exit strategy, he didn't really spend any time thinking about that. And so this is kind of the genesis of why I created Aligned Advisors, was a lot because what my grandfather went through, and then subsequently what we've just seen many doctors that we've had the opportunity to speak with, also experience similar situations. So as you can imagine, this had a very negative effect on both he and my grandmother throughout the remaining years of their life. And they were forced to sell their dream home. They had to live in a significantly reduced lifestyle. And my grandmother even had to end up going back to work part-time, teaching flute lessons to help pay some of the bills. So, needless to say, my grandfather did not have a plan for leaving dentistry on his terms. That's what we're going to spend our time tonight talking about and going through and exploring this evening. So one of the first things that we want to make sure that I think is extremely important is that, design is creating something on purpose for a particular purpose. So when you look at this Ferrari, the engineers at Ferrari designed that car to look like that for a specific reason. The Vietnam Memorial, it's probably not a coincidence that it lines up, exactly with the Washington Monument. And then you look at the iPod, which is what a great invention for those of us who remember having to carry around a duffel bag full of cassette tapes and CDs along with our Walkman. The iPod came along, and it was a great design. And so design is, most of us go through our life paying down debt, paying our bills, saving what we can into our 401k without really giving it much thought. We go to, sell our practice and hope we can get as much as we can for that to help fund our lives, but really there has been very little thought and planning put into that. So design is always intentional. It does not happen by accident. So, I'm going to just go out on a limb here and guess that when Frank Lloyd Wright designed the waterfall house, as it's known, for the Kaufman family, it probably wasn't an accident that the house ended up being put over a waterfall. So the question we ask, that I would ask each of you here with us this evening is, do you have a plan in place that has been intentionally designed for you, for your needs, for what you want to have, what you want to accomplish? So we're going to talk about a few things. The first thing we're going to do is that we're talking about the 6 steps of how to get started. So the first one is that we're going to address is, at some point, I'm sure you've all had this conversation. At least I hope you've all had a conversation, whether it be with yourselves or a colleague or your spouse or significant other, about what life after dentistry would look like. And where do you start? So where I would suggest where we're going to start is, number one, is with a vision. You want to make sure you have a very clear vision of what that exit is going to look like. What do you want the remaining years of life in dentistry and after dentistry, to look like? So the first step we have in here is make sure you involve your spouse, your significant other, your partner, because these are, a lot of times it's not uncommon that each of you might have a little different view or perception as to what's important or what that might look like. And so you definitely want to get their input as you start to think through this. And I'm going to give you some very tangible questions and exercises here in just a minute to go through. Then the next is, as you do, what are you going to talk to them about? So, one place to start is to start talking about what life looks like over the next 5, 10, 15, or 20 years. Really sit down and talk about what that looks like, and then the smaller steps of how do you actually get there. So many of us have heard Stephen Covey's most quoted line, begin with the end in mind. But what does that actually mean? How do we actually do that? So what we do is one of the exercises that I would have you go through is an exercise that we call the 7 F's. So those are family, friends or friendship, faith, fitness, fun, finance, and philanthropy. Now, I know we don't spell philanthropy with a F here in the States, but in Canada I think things are a little differently. But I'm joking, Jared, and giving you a hard time. The reason I put an F there is because I couldn't call it the 7 F's if I did spell it with a PH. So a good exercise to go through is to go through those 7 F's and ask these 5 questions. What does it look like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? Who are you with? And what's important about this to you? So the other reason this is a good idea to go through with your spouse is because when they answer that question, the fourth question there, who are you with, you probably want to make sure that you're the answer to that question, or at least involved in that question in some way, and probably the sooner you know that, the better. So I would strongly recommend that you spend some time, go through these questions. This is the great place to start as you begin to put together this vision. The next thing that you should know, as the sooner the better, is what's your number. So many of us are familiar with ING did a great job with this commercial, with these ads about what your number is. But why is this important? So a lot of us, when we think of this number, we think of retirement or financial freedom or maybe a specific goal that tends to be around that idea of retiring or no longer working. But there's really more to that number that what we find when we start talking to people, when we talk to new clients or prospective clients, that maybe they hadn't thought of before. So for example, does that number include insurance payments while you're no longer working? Does it include debt service? Are you out of debt? Do you just have your home debt? Do you have any vacation homes that you're still paying? Does that include travel? What about college for kids or grandkids? Any medical expenses, unforeseen home repairs or car repairs? So there really are, when we ask this question, how much money would you like to have, or what does this start to look like, typically when we get that first answer from people, some of this stuff they hadn't really thought through. And so a lot of times that number is significantly different when they start to crunch the numbers or really start to put some thought around what that actually looks like or what it might actually take. One of the reports that we provide to clients is a report that's called Income from Assets. And what this report does is it tells the clients exactly how much income they can pull from all of their assets for the rest of their life. And why this report is probably one of my favorite and definitely one of our clients' favorite reports is because, what if you found out today that the assets you had could actually provide you with the income that you wanted right now, but you just didn't know it? Imagine what that might change in your life if you did know that you had enough assets to generate enough income for the rest of your life. What would change? So these are just some of the reasons why knowing that number is so important and so valuable. Yet very, very few people that I've spoken to actually have an idea of what that is. So the second thing we're going to talk about, it's point number 3 in our list of 6 things of how to get started, are your values. So what do we mean by values? So we're not just talking about words on a wall, right? Some of us may have in our kitchen or living rooms, family, friendship, happiness. We're talking about things that are more deeply rooted in our why things are important to us, why we're willing to make certain sacrifices to get where we want to be. So why do we start the design with values? Well, Roy Disney, Walt Disney's brother, had a great quote. He said, when your values are clear, decision-making is easy. So what does that mean? In order to understand what that means, and more importantly, how do we apply it to our lives, we have to understand this principle first, that values must be ranked. Okay? So your most important value, number 1, must always be more important than number 2. Number 2 must always be more important than number 3, and 3 must always be important than number 4, and so on. Well, so here's an example of what I mean by that. So in this example, there's 2 doctors. Doctor number 1, his number 1 value is family. Number 2 is faith. Number 3 is philanthropy. Number 4 is friendship. Number 5 is financial success. And number 2, his number 1, or hers, their number 1 value is financial success. Number 2 is philanthropy. Number 3 is family. Number 4 is friendship. And number 5 is faith. So here's the scenario, and this illustrates Roy Disney's point and why we start with values perfectly. These doctors are leaving work, and they each get a phone call from a colleague, another doctor from across town, who invites them to come have dinner with them that evening, and instead of going home, to come have dinner to talk about how they might work more closely together to help each other's businesses grow. What will Dr. 1 most likely say to that invitation? Well, if family is number 1, most likely he will decline the invitation being home with his family for dinner is the most important thing. Doctor number 2 may choose to take that invitation because for this doctor, financial success is actually the most important value for them. Now, we don't make value judgments. One's not important one's not better than the other. One's not more important than the other. Each of us are going to have different values and they're going to be ranked differently. But it's so important because it can save so much time when it comes to making decisions in your life if you take the time and go through and actually list out the values and rank those values. So values must be ranked. The second thing that we do under the second most important aspect under design are our goals. Now, we're not just talking about financial goals. We all have non-financial goals as well. Whether they're non-financial, such as getting in shape, spending more time with our family, having family dinner, or whether they're financial, such as buying a house, paying for college vacations, whatever that might be, we all know this. This is not news to us. Goals must be documented. So besides the fact that it's been proven time and time again that when we write goals down, the probability of us achieving those goals is much greater, I would also encourage you to write down the following for each of your goals. Name the goal. Come up with a specific name so that has meaning to you. So instead of saying vacation home, write down, beach house in Miami Beach, Florida, or wherever it is that is going to help inspire you. Name those goals. Number 2, you want to put a due date for when you want to achieve that goal. You want to put specific amounts, whether it's a weight loss, a specific amount of weight you want to lose, or a specific number of times you want to work out, or even a specific dollar amount, and then how you're going to fund them, and most importantly, why that goal is important to you. What benefit or how is achieving that goal going to impact your life? And write down those descriptive words, because that's the why that is going to help you pull through when it gets hard and you have to achieve those goals. The second thing under goals is just like our values, goals must be ranked. The reason is because maybe all of our goals are important, and one may not be more important than the other, but if we have limited resources and we need to know where to put our money, if we have our goals ranked, it makes it very easy to do so. So for example, if putting my 3 kids through college is the most important goal to me, and financial freedom and buying a vacation home and all those are still important goals but not as important, and kids' college is ranked number 1, and I have to save $10,000 a year to do that, and I have $12,000 a year that I can do that with, automatically I know that $10,000 is going to funding my kids' education because that's the most important goal. So we ask the question, if you only had enough money to achieve one of your goals, which one would it be? And that's how we start to go through the ranking process. So goals must be documented, goals must be ranked, and then goals must have metrics. So the best way that I can illustrate this is there's a law called the Aggregation of Marginal Gains. And there's a gentleman by the name of Sir Dave Brailsford. For any of you who are cycling enthusiasts, Sir Dave Brailsford was the team manager of Team Sky, and the British cycling team who won, Team Sky who won the 2012, 2013, and 2015 Tour de France's, and then the British cycling team which won 8 gold medals in the 2000 Olympics. So Sir Dave Brailsford came up with this aggregation of marginal gains to help his cycling team win more races. And his theory was this: if the team could just improve in many different areas by just 1%, although that doesn't sound like a lot, what he found was that over time, it would make a huge difference. So what Sir Dave Brailsford said was that in the beginning, there's basically no difference between making a choice that is 1% better or 1% worse. In other words, it won't impact you very much today, but as time goes on, what you'll start to realize is that these small improvements or declines compound, and suddenly you find yourself in a very big gap between the people who make slightly better choices on a daily basis and those who don't. So this is why small choices don't make much of a difference at the time, but that they do add up over the long term. So the reason we say put metrics around your goals is because many of us don't measure the progress that either we are or aren't making on each of our goals. So I asked the question, when would you want to know whether you were on track or off track or ahead of track in reaching one of your goals? I would argue that most of us would say as soon as possible, because if we're off track, we then have a better chance and a shorter gap to fill to get back on track. So measuring your goals is something we just don't see a lot of people do, but yet it's so important. So, what if, here's the question, what if you've waited too long or you feel like you've waited too long? So going back to my grandfather, I would say that the only way that you would know whether or not you waited too long or not is when you find yourself either being forced to stop practicing or going to stop practicing, and then you realize what many doctors, dentists we talk to realize, whether or not they've fallen short or whether they're fine. And I would argue that you don't have to wait until you're ready to transition or stop practicing to find out. We have people calling us all the time who are 5 to 10 years out from wanting to stop practicing, and most of the time they don't know if they have enough to stop practicing or not. So knowing your number, measuring your progress are extremely, extremely important. The other thing we see, which gets me amped up, is a lot of dentists, your largest asset is your practice. Yet, if we were to ask you if someone were to ask you what the value of your practice was, many dentists couldn't answer that question. So how is it that your CPA, your financial advisors, your whoever in your life have allowed you to go through your career, your life, without knowing the value and without constantly monitoring and measuring the value of what is most likely your largest asset? Many of us could probably, within a pretty good ballpark, give what our homes are worth, yet we couldn't do that same thing for our practices. So again, knowing those numbers is extremely, extremely important. So after the third piece under the design is putting together an action plan. So the magazine, Worth Magazine, did a study several years ago, and a Zurich-based financial consulting firm, DeVere Group, surveyed people with at least $1 million in investable assets. And they asked them the question, what did they regret most financially speaking? And here are their answers. Number one, the number one answer was not having put in place a regularly reviewed financial plan early in life. Number two is not consistently scrutinizing personal investments or having them objectively reviewed. So objectively means to have them reviewed by someone who doesn't want to sell you something in return. So rather pay a flat fee for an independent review is how you're truly going to get that objective review. And the number three, their third answer, was taking on unnecessary debt. So we use this tool here. Not sure what happened with the visual here, but we use this tool called the Financial Roadmap. And what this does is essentially puts into place those first four items we've talked about. The staircase represents the values conversation, your values ranked from the bottom to the top being your most important value. The shields, 1, 2, and 3, are the goals ranked in order of importance, and then a snapshot of where the individual is at that point in their life. So for us, we've used this tool to be able to facilitate those first four things. And then the action item that you must have, or there are 10 items that you must have for your plan. The first is a step-by-step plan of action. So this is literally like a to-do list specifically for you to follow so you're making progress towards achieving your goals. So for example, you've just met with your insurance agent and they tell you that you need to go home and walk through your entire home with a video camera to video all of your belongings so that in the event of a fire or flood or theft, you know and you have proof, tangible proof, of exactly what you have and you'll be able to replace it. Well, for most of us, we leave that meeting and maybe we do it and maybe we don't. We get busy, things happen. So what you should do, and what we recommend, is each time you meet with, whether it be your insurance agent, your tax planning individual, your legal estate planning, asset protection, financial advisor, and they give you something to do, whether it be an email or in that meeting, have a master task list, write it down, and then rank those in order of importance as far as which will have the greatest impact on your life, whether you do it or don't do it. So you can do this with all of your advisors, as we just said, and that way you'll always have this kind of ongoing master task list. the second must-have for a successful plan is a cash reserve plan. So there have been many studies recently that have come out that have said that, we've read a recent study that said 75% of Americans don't even have enough cash on hand to cover a $500 emergency. So a cash reserve plan should be a well-thought-out plan where money is specifically set aside for your cash reserves in case of emergencies, but also to hold you over during any waiting periods. So many of you may or may not know that your disability insurance, there is most likely a waiting period in there before the benefit starts. A lot of insurance have those. So do you have enough savings set aside to be able to cover that waiting period? Or there are some riders you can buy with your insurance to cover those for you. Just costs more money. A debt plan. You should have a specific plan to reduce or eliminate your debt on a schedule that works within your means. So I always give the example of, if you had $50,000 sitting in your bank account at the end of the year, what do you do with it? Do you pay off debt? Do you prepay your taxes? Do you fund retirement? Do you, go buy a toy? What do you do with that? And when you have this plan, these 10 items, it makes it very clear where that money should go without you having to spend a lot of time. So you should have a very specific plan for how to pay your debt off in what order. The fourth is insurance plan. So when's the last time you had an independent review of all of your insurance coverages? So you can call almost any independent insurance agent and ask them how much they would charge you to review all of your insurances, business and personal. Most of them will do it for free because they want to win your business. You can let them, if you don't want to do it that way, you can even let them know up front that you will not be buying any insurance from them. This is kind of if you want to have a fun time, let them know you will not be buying any insurance from them, but you will pay them for their time. And this will usually cost you between $150 to $250 to have a review done correctly. And what you end up finding is you end up getting a very good kind of third-person review of your insurances. In the benefit of saving time, I could give you a lot of stories of people we've talked to, clients we've had where prior to working with us, there was inappropriate insurance coverages, and a lot of people end up having to pay out a lot of money out of pocket because this for something that's so easy that really doesn't take up that much of your time to do. It's well worth it. Number 5 is a plan for assets. So this is not just how you will invest your money during your working years, but also includes how you will take your money out in a way that doesn't deplete your assets too fast. The number one concern for people looking at into stopping practicing or retirement or financial freedom, whatever you want to call it, the number one concern is running out of money, outliving your assets. I always tell people, we kind of think that putting money aside is the hardest part of getting ready to transition to this next phase in our life. And the reality is it's actually taking the money out in the correct sequence, paying the least amount of taxes, doing it in a way that we're not going to run out of money is actually a lot harder. Number 6 is a comprehensive financial plan. So again, this is a plan that you've paid someone independently to put together for you where they're not going to be selling you any products. So that's extremely, extremely important. A comprehensive financial plan should address identity theft protection, credit protection, and should look at all expenses that you're going to be faced with during now and afterwards. Tax planning. This is a piece that we, again, see a lot of area for improvement. So we always ask questions when clients come on. One of the questions we ask is, how frequently do you meet with your CPA? Well, the answer is either 0 or 1. If you meet with your CPA, I would say, more than 4 times a year, that's probably a pretty good proactive CPA. And as long as those meetings are talking about taxes and tax strategies. So this is an area where we help out a tremendous amount with our clients because, as many of us know, we've probably all sat across from our CPA and talked about tax strategies, yet when we see our tax bill at the end of the year, we start to think, what in the world happened to all of this that we just talked about, these tax strategies that were supposedly going to save me all this money? Well, the problem is, as with a lot of this stuff, it's the implementation of those strategies that falls apart, which is why we don't, as individuals and as clients, we don't realize the benefit of that advice. Number 8 is estate planning. So I'd say probably one of the most common things we hear from in our first appointments is that we haven't had our wills and trusts reviewed in quite a while, or we don't have any. I was at dinner last night with a doctor who has been working as an associate in a practice where the doctor had passed away over a year ago. I'm in California, so the California Dental Board allows you, the spouse of a doctor, to operate their practice for 12 months after the death of a doctor. This wife had been operating the practice for 15 months. There are all kinds of problems and issues, but one of the biggest reasons she was delayed was because there was no estate plan in place. This was a second marriage. There were kids from his first marriage, so the whole thing got tied up in probate and ended up being a huge mess and will most likely cost his wife a significant amount of money. So again, this is something that may cost you a little bit of time, a little bit of money, but get your estate plan reviewed. And if you don't have an estate plan, this is something, again, we can help implement at a very reasonable cost with some firms that we work with. This is probably one of the most important ones, and is number 9, regular meetings to update your progress. So in 2009, we interviewed our clients and asked them how often they would want to meet with their advisors to know that they were either on track or off track. And the answer came back pretty resounding, 3 times a year. So the question I have for you is, how often are you meeting with your advisors to make sure that they're aware of any changes that you may be having, that you may have going on in your life, updating you on any plans you have coming up in your life? How many of them are aware of what you want to do over the next 1 to 3 to 5 to 10 years and are actually putting in place strategies to help you get there, in the most efficient way? You know, maybe 3 times a year seems too much. So for you, you need to figure out what is that number so that you feel like you're on top of everything and your advisors are on top of everything. So I personally sit down once every 90 days and reevaluate my goals and my progress. So for each of us, again, it's going to be different. So sometimes what is important to you before is no longer important to you now. And again, the more frequently you meet with your advisors, the more you guys can talk about that and reevaluate those goals. And finally, number 10, a specific plan for each goal. So we internally call these goal blueprints, and it's a very specific outline of what you need to do step by step to achieve each goal. So each goal should be treated kind of as a separate mini plan, and you should be very clear and know exactly what to do every year so that you are able to reach your goals. So lastly is take action. So you've involved your spouse. You've talked about what you want to do over the next 5 to 20 years and what those look like. You've looked at your design. You've talked about values and goals, and you now have this action plan in place. Finally, it's to take action, to execute, to implement those strategies. So when it comes to taking action, what do you have control over? So one of the things we talk to people about all the time is focus on what you can control and only what's within your control. Don't worry about Brexit or don't worry about these other things and how those are going to impact your life. If you have a well-thought-out, comprehensive plan and are meeting regularly, those things that are outside of our control are going to be taken into account and can be adapted within the plan because you're meeting regularly. But instead, focus on what you can control. Things like spending, how much debt you take, how to pay off your debt, your health, relationships. Divorce is a horrible wealth-building strategy. So, work on relationships with our family. You'll live longer, and so that you can enjoy your money. You can focus on your advisors. You can focus on the strength and the health of your practice. So list out the things. Next time you're feeling like things are out of control or you're not really sure where you're headed, sit down and list out everything that you do have control over, and that's a great place to start. So if you want to accomplish the goals you have set, where should your focus and energy go? And what I suggest is that you focus on the things that you can control. So I'll close with a success story. I opened with my grandfather, and I'll close with a success story. We have a client of ours, Dr. T, and right out of dental school, he knew that he wanted to stop practicing when he was 52. At age 33, he bought the building that his practice was in. He is in California, so it is possible I know those of you outside of California think it's not possible, but it is possible, but not common, but it is possible to have a building ownership in California. So Dr. T became a client of ours when he was 34, and in the last 6 years, he's made great strides towards achieving his goals of being done at 52. He has partial ownership in 5 commercial buildings. He owns several practices in addition to several small businesses that are generating income for him. In addition, he and his wife are living well within their means, and he is an avid saver. Dr. T set up a fun money account where he can save money every month and invest it in things that he likes to invest in. So he likes to invest in some small side projects. He's got that there. It's not going to impact his plan. If he does lose this money, it's not going to affect his plan. And so because we meet regularly, he knows exactly where he's at, and he and his wife know exactly where he's at. Also, we talk about contingency plans. In the event that something were to happen to you, does your spouse or significant other know what to do, where to go, how the practice is going to be sold, what to do with the practice? We had a client who was, by all means, in very good health, and got that call one morning, early morning. I got a call from his wife. He had passed away in his sleep. Because everything was in order and we had a plan in place, we were able to execute the plan. His practice sold a little less than 2 months later for almost 100% of what the asking price was. So having those contingency plans and talking through this is extremely important because we just don't know what's going to happen. So going back to Dr. T, the reason he's a great example as a success story is because he started early. He had a very clear vision of where he wanted his life to be. He had a plan that was designed with purpose. Now, I will mention that his father passed away of a heart attack at age 54 while playing basketball at their church. So when Dr. T was only 29 years old when that happened. So this was a big motivator for him to create the plan and follow it. But for each of you, I would imagine maybe it doesn't have to be that tragic, but for each of you, I would imagine that there are those reasons deep down where when you have to sacrifice, you can dig down to do that. So focus on the things that are 100% within your control. So the question is, what is in the way of you being able to leave dentistry on your terms? Spend some time and think about that. Answer that. Write that down. Think through that. It may be a myriad of things, but as you start to list those down and prioritize them, that can help you start to overcome and get closer to where you ultimately want to be. So at Aligned Advisors, what we do is we basically have a 3-pronged promise to our clients. We align your financial choices with your most important goals and most deeply held values, like we discussed. We are committed to get our clients' entire financial house in order and keep it that way forever, meaning for as long as we work together, we will keep their life in order. And the benefit that our clients receive is that they're able to have a 10 out of 10 level of confidence that no matter what happens in the markets, the economy, or the world, that they will achieve their goals. Most of us, your model looks like this, which we call this the broken model. So you're in the middle and you have all these advisors who you're meeting with. Well, you're the person, when you do meet with them and they give you assignments to do, whether it's send in your QuickBooks or, go copy when you go to finance or refinance, there's all these documents you have to give. They're putting that back on your plate, who you have the least amount of time, the least amount of experience, and really the least amount of desire to do that. So our recommendation and our model that we find works typically better is for what we do is we put ourselves in the middle and coordinate all of that advice and all of the implementation pieces of the action items so that you're actually making progress and you are able to are removed from that and are able to spend more time focusing on those things that you can control and that are going to bring you more benefit and more value to your life. So Aligned Advisors, we are 100% transparent. There are no conflicts with our relationships. All advisors on our team are paid a flat fee for their service. We sell no products. We don't sell insurance. We do not sell any products. We take no commissions or referral fees. We do not charge a percentage of your assets. We are not money managers. We are not financial advisors. We're not asset managers. All recommendations are 100% objective and agenda-free. We work for you. We only work for you for one simple flat fee, period. So if you'd like additional information, you can please email me here. There are a couple things. If you'd like us to help you design your plan, if you'd like us to help you clarify your values, if you'd like us to help you define and prioritize your goals, and if you'd like us to create a comprehensive step-by-step strategy to ensure that you'll be able to leave dentistry on your terms, if you'd like us to run a truth and fees analysis to tell you exactly what you're paying in commissions, what you're paying your CPA, your other advisors, so you can judge whether or not how much value you're getting there, please send me an email, and we'll be happy to do that. So at the close here, there are two things that we'll offer. The first is that we offer a complimentary 1-hour road mapping session. This is a $1,200 value where we will actually take the time and sit down with you and your significant other to go through your values. Again, I apologize you can't see this very clearly. Your goals, prioritizing those, and give you a snapshot of exactly where you are today so that you can take those first steps to beginning to design your strategy for leaving dentistry on your terms. The second thing that we'll offer is if you'll email me, there's a book that Dr. Michael Abernathy, who's a dentist out of McKinney, Texas, wrote. I actually wrote a chapter in that book. It's called it's called The Road to Wealth and Security by Dr. Michael Abernathy, and it's a complete guide to dental transitions. It's about 272 pages of detailed information on how to create exceptional additional income through partnership process. It's about how to transition out of dentistry, and it's a great read. Like I said, it's got a lot of information in there. There's even some sample contracts in there. I believe Michael charges typically $94 for that, but if you'll email me, I can get that for you at a significant discount. I think he said 50% off is what typically we can do there. But for those of you who actually sign up for the complimentary 1-hour road mapping session, we'll actually throw that in at the end of that. We'll actually throw in that book as well. So I appreciate, Jared, you having me.
Yeah, absolutely, John. And you know, just to kind of summarize here, I hope you all have gained a lot of information about how you can be properly setting yourself up for transition, not only through the lease agreement, you know, but generally to live a cleaner and smoother and better life post-sale. And what I'm going to do here is I will switch to the comment section for those of you who didn't have a chance to jot down either mine or Jonathan's information that will be available to you. To both of our points, if you're interested in having us, Cirrus, take a look at your lease agreements, rental rates, or having any type of consultation or phone call from Jonathan, please, by all means, spend some time over the next week or two reaching out to us. We'd be more than happy to field calls from any of you, talk about questions, strategies moving forward. But generally, you know, Jonathan and myself just want to thank you all for spending the time to speak with us tonight. And again, there will be a comment section and follow-up that if you do have any immediate questions, you know, feel free to reach out as well. And Jonathan, if you just want to thank as well.
Yeah, thanks again. Feel free to email me. I'm happy to answer any questions. And Jared, thanks for having us.
Absolutely. And thanks to everybody as well. Take care. Have a great evening.